Your most valuable asset is your time, because it's an asset that can never be replaced. And during the time that you spend at work, 5 or 6 days a week, you are constantly bombarded with communication. And the piece of equipment that you get a very high proportion of your communication through is one of these. And this is probably the biggest obstacle, the biggest barrier between me and giving you an effective presentation over the next 72 minutes or so. Because depending on which online survey you look at, we look at our phones somewhere between 80 and 150 times a day. Our eyes are on the screen, our head is in the cloud. So I'm going to ask you all to do me a favor. I'd like you all, please, to take out your phones and make sure that they're all switched on. And then, during the course of the next 71 minutes, please look at them anytime with my complete blessing. Because in the attention deficit-dominated year of 2018, if when I'm doing a speech, you think that the contents of your inbox are more compelling than what I'm saying, then it's me that's being rude, not you, because I would have been wasting your time. Now, I call my technique bare-knuckle presenting because I'm constantly prepared to fight for your attention against the attention that you might focus on your phone. I want to make something very clear straight away. Although I'm going to give you a 5-step technique, arguably presenting, and by the way, I use presenting, presentation, public speaking, and speaking to essentially mean the same thing. Presenting only involves 2 phases. Phase number 1, choosing what to say. Phase number 2, saying it. It's really very simple. As the great American philosopher Britney Spears once said, this is not rocket surgery. Now, as you're probably aware from having read the London Business Forum's excellent marketing materials, I am a barrister, and of course, I went into presentation coaching and professional speaking because, of course, compared to people who work for the multinationals that you work for in this room, barristers are, of course, very badly paid. Now, look, if you look at barrister in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find it right in between bankrupt and bastard. But my time as a criminal barrister has actually profoundly affected my attitude to public speaking. Because a contested Crown Court jury trial is essentially a presentation competition between the prosecution barrister and the defense barrister. The judge is merely a neutral umpire. It's the jury that decides who wins the competition by deciding whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. Now, many people think that the most important part of a criminal trial is the cross-examination of the witnesses. Well, I believe that the most important part of a criminal trial is the closing speech, because that is the last chance that any of the barristers get to influence the minds of the jury before they make their final decision about guilt or innocence. Now, during my 14 years at the bar, I noticed that most of the speeches done by most barristers in most cases were very long indeed. And often those speeches would start off with a fateful phrase like, well, I've only 27 points of evidence I'd like to cover, and I'm sure I'll get through them in under 3 hours or so. I could see the heads of the jury dropping even after the second sentence of the barrister's speech. And I quickly realized that it was much more effective to do a much shorter closing speech, which only covered 5 or maybe even 3 points. Somehow, we're comfortable with the number 3. Friends, Romans, countrymen. I came, I saw, I conquered. I've got nothing to offer you apart from blood, sweat, and tears. Well, actually, in that speech in 1940, Winston Churchill said, I've nothing to offer you but blood, sweat, toil, and tears. But hey, he broke the rule of 3, so we've forgotten about the toil. So 3 is a really good number of points to get across in a presentation. The maximum I believe you should try to get across is 5. Now, I'm not going to try and give you a scientific justification for that. All I know is that we run out of memory at the same time as we run out of digits on one hand. That is why I've got 5 steps in my bare-knuckle methodology, and it's only 5 steps that I cover whether I'm doing a speech or when I'm writing a book. I have to say, though, that I have been guilty in the past of occasional verbosity. When I wrote my book, my favorite review that I got on Amazon said, and I quote, "Graham Bloody Davis spends 17 interminable chapters and 68,000 tedious words continually preaching to us to be concise." Well, that was excellent feedback for me, because I've learnt my lesson, and now whenever I'm doing a speech myself or advising someone else on their presentation, I'm continually looking for the opportunity to cut down the number of words that are used and said. So if I'd been advising William Shakespeare, he would eventually have written a play called All's Well That Ends. Because for me, one of my cardinal mottos that I live by is this: a speech that tries to include everything usually achieves nothing. I regard the situation as a universal one in this sense. You are speaking or presenting every time that you're standing in front of an audience of 2 or more people and you're trying to persuade them to adopt your point of view. You're not going to be able to do that with information alone, because let's face it, all the information in the world is continually available to everyone just at the tips of their fingers on their phones. You have to have information plus attitude. And I believe that the attitude you should have is one of persuasive leadership, leading the audience from where they are to where you want them to be. Which brings me on to step 1 of my 5-step method. Step 1 is analyze your audience. Now, first of all, I'm going to deal with situations where you might have not just 2 people, perhaps 1 person in front of you, or certainly under 5 people in front of you. The classic business presentation, very small audience. With a very small audience, especially with 1 person, you should try to make a gut instinct guess as to what the preferred communication style of that individual or those individuals are. Now, I'm not suggesting that you ask them to do some form of DISC analysis or take a Myers-Briggs test, but you can pick up some useful cues and useful clues from a few bits of conversation or interaction before the presentation starts. In my view, there are 4 basic communication styles. Style number 1 is the director style. Directors are firm and forceful, confident and competitive, decisive and determined. They like to get things done, and they like to get things done immediately. A director will often have the heads of dead animals on the wall of their office, animals that they've probably killed themselves. Their idea of a pleasant conversation consists of, what's the problem? What's your decision? Thank you very much. Now get out. They're often wrongly accused of not caring about other people's feelings. Well, that's unfair because they've never even thought about other people's feelings. Their motto in life is ready, fire, aim. They're not very good at giving out praise. The only time you'll hear them saying well done is when they're ordering a steak. When you're dealing with a director type, get straight to the point. The second type of communication style is the socializer. A socializer is outgoing, optimistic, and enthusiastic. They love ideas, they love to be the center of attention, they love to network, and they love to talk, especially about their favorite subject, which is, of course, themselves. A conversation with a socializer usually consists of them saying, me, 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 but hey, enough of me talking about myself, what do you think of me? These people have the attention span of a mosquito. They hate paperwork, and they do like hard work, but they like hard work to include having a good time. They do occasionally like details, but details are for you to sweat, not them. Generally speaking, a socializer is generally speaking. When you're dealing with a socializer, communicating with a socializer, you should try and build up a happy rapport before starting to get to the point. The third type is a relator. Relators are genial team players who prefer stability over risk. They actually care about the relationships they have, not only at home, but at work as well. They only like change if it's absolutely necessary. These people like to work as a team to a mutually agreed goal. When you're communicating with a relator, you should do it in a calm and caring way so that they feel you are sensitive to their core needs and also sensitive to the core needs of the people surrounding them. Type number 4 is the thinker. Thinkers are self-controlled and cautious. Some people think that they are introverted, but actually that's not always the case. They prefer analysis over emotion, inward thinking rather than outward talking. They like things to be given to them in a clear order. They love lists. They love lists of lists, especially lists with numbers in them. They have an eye for detail, which is either inspiring or nauseating, depending on your point of view. These are people who actually enjoy reading the software manual. When you're communicating with a thinker, make sure you give them as much detailed information as possible so that they can arrive at a carefully calculated conclusion. Thinkers often find it difficult to get on with the other 3 types of communicator because they find directors to be rather too callous, they find socializers to be rather too talkative, and they find relators to be too damned sensitive. Now, I'm going to give you a very bold piece of advice. Whether it's dealing with a very small group of people of under 5 or a larger group of people. Again, in attention deficit-dominated 2018, unless you have excellent evidence from an unimpeachable source of which you are totally confident, you should assume that everybody in your audience is a director type. In 2018, it is never wrong to get straight to the point immediately. Obviously, you must try to take into account the needs of the other types of a communicator, in that hopefully to keep the socializers happy, you will have an element of humor. To deal with the relators, there might be some interaction. And for the thinkers, you should include some numbers, like the number 5, for instance. In 2018, your core default mode should be that of being a director. I also suggest that with a small audience, you might take this bold step. Try to communicate with them in advance of the presentation with a short phone call or a short visit to their office. Say to them, you only want 3 minutes of the time, and ask them one question. And the question is this: what can I tell you in my presentation tomorrow that will immediately make your life easier? Often their answer will be, wow, I don't know. No one's ever asked me that question before a presentation before. And that will develop into a longer conversation, which must be a good thing. Even if the answer is brief or non-committal, you will still get a positive bounce from having had the courtesy to ask that question, because it is so unusual that people bother to do that. I've always been very suspicious of the use of computers and technology when it comes to dealing with people and increasing the level of human interaction. But maybe I'm just an old-fashioned Luddite. And I've learnt my lesson because recently I read a report which was published by the London Business School. And what they did was to use an ingenious new piece of software to assess people's communication styles based on the color of car that they drive. And what they discovered was, if you drive a black car, you're very likely to be a very focused, driven, ambitious individual. If you drive a red car, you're likely to have an extremely high sex drive. That's the good news. But if you drive a yellow or a green car, you're likely to be stable, placid, and frankly, just a little bit boring. However, if you are arrogant, sarcastic, occasionally dishonest, and often very violent, you'll almost certainly drive a white car with a blue light flashing on top of it. When you're dealing with a larger audience than 5, please get into the habit of asking these 5 questions in the same way as I've asked these 5 questions of the London Business Forum organisers for the purposes of today. Question number 1. Who are they? Well, thanks to Brendan, I know exactly what companies you're all from and all of your job titles. I even know whether there are any Italians or Australians in the room. I have a pretty good idea of your nationality base, your age range, your job titles, and your areas of expertise. Now, I'm sure that you do that automatically anyway as part of your audience research, but I suggest you do it in as much detail as you possibly can for any audience that you speak to. Question number 2, why are they there in that room? Now, I do know that at least 20 of you probably are here mainly to see the speaker this afternoon, and you've just come here to fill up your morning. I accept that as a possibility. And often the question, why are they there, is often because they've been told to be there. But for at least 80% of you, I know one thing that flatters me enormously as a speaker. You are here because you've taken the trouble to look at the London Business Forum website, consider what presentations fulfill your needs during the course of a year, and you've booked this one. So I know that most of you are here because you want to be, and you want to hear the information that was mentioned on the website. Question number 3, what do they expect to hear? Well, I mean that in a slightly cynical way, in that I think most audiences expect to hear the same old stuff as they've heard before on that topic from all the other speakers that they've heard before on that topic. I suggest that you always try to give your audience something that's unexpected, that makes it worthwhile them turning up. So you actually persuade them to move out of their comfort zone into your persuasion zone. Question number 4 may sound a bit like question number 3, but it's subtly different. Question number 4 is, what do they need to hear? Now, some audiences haven't decided before you start to speak exactly what they need, and this is why asking them in advance helps, but also it gives you the chance to be a leader. And again, fortunately, I know today that you've specifically chosen to come to a presentation which is about the 5 steps to becoming a better speaker. And so that gives me a huge positive springboard on which to do my detailed preparation. Question number 5 is a bit of a mouthful, but it's a very important catch-all question, and a question that you should never lose sight of during the time that you're preparing your presentation and the time that you're delivering it. Question number 5 is this: what must you give them during the course of your presentation that guarantees that you get what you want from having given the presentation? What must you give them during the course of your presentation that guarantees that you get what you want from having given the presentation? That is the Holy Grail. If I could tell my clients that I'm advising the answer to that question correctly every time, I'd be charging £1 million a day. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question each time, but you should always strive to find it during your preparation process, because that is the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail piece of information that I've been given today, of course, is this: I know that each of you will be given a copy of my book before you go home, which means that my presentation this morning needs only to be an overview, a sort of match-of-the-day highlights package. It doesn't have to go into exhaustive and exhausting detail, because hopefully you're going to be able to read the other 67,000 words when you get home. Step number 1, therefore, was audience analysis. From the information that you've got from your audience analysis, you can go on to step 2, which is what I call choose your positions. Because the information that you've got from your audience analysis allows you to make a good guess at what the audience's starting position is. My definition of a starting position is this: it's what your audience knows, thinks, or feels before you've started speaking to them. Your job as a speaker is to lead them on a shortish, straightish journey to the finishing position. The finishing position is what you want the audience to know, think, or feel by the time you've finished presenting to them. Ideally, the finishing position should be measurable, realistic, and timely. Measurable in the sense that it should be something as specific as possible. Realistic in the sense that you shouldn't be asking them for making too long a journey from start to finish. And thirdly, timely. Can it be achieved in the time available? Now, again, I'm going to make a bold, sweeping statement, which may make you wince a little bit, but it is useful in the process. Often, people's starting positions can be put into 4 categories. An audience may be ignorant, vaguely in favor, or vaguely against your topic or your attitude to your topic. Now, for the purposes of today, I know that this audience is neither ignorant nor indifferent to the topic of presentation, because otherwise you wouldn't have turned up. And I'm thinking that probably you're not going to be vaguely against the idea of having a technique, a specific 5-step process. Really, the vast majority of you, 99% of you, will be sitting here thinking, I've come here to get some form of process, and I'm open-minded to the possibility of it being Graham's process that I'll adopt from now on. The finishing position that I'm aiming at is to change you from being vaguely in favor of the possibility of a process into raving, roaring, rampaging, fanatical fans of my process, so that at the end of my presentation, you can't wait to ask questions. When you get home, you can't wait to read my book. And when you get into the office tomorrow, you can't wait to put it into action. That is the bullseye that I'm aiming for today. So, step 1, audience analysis. Step 2, decide on your positions, starting position and finishing position. Step 3, you have to give them a reason for moving from the starting position to the finishing position, an engine that drives them on the way. That engine is the message. Step 3, I call making your message. Now, the word message and the concept of messaging has been used, overused, misused, and abused by salespeople, marketing directors, and politicians for thousands and thousands of years. But the concept of messaging is still a very useful one, provided it is defined precisely. I'm going to give you 2 different types of messages for the purposes of this presentation today. But only the second type is one that you're going to actually use in your own presentations. Nevertheless, it's important that you know both types of message to give you a context on which to operate. Type number 1 is what I call a macro message. A macro message is a sequence of words which quickly and compellingly captures the essence of your company, your product, or your idea. It's what you see in advertising slogans. Coke is the real thing. Nike, just do it. Now, although those slogans have been around for a long time and they've had a certain level of value, these days they look a bit vague, don't they? Coke, it's the real what? Nike, just do what exactly? Better and more effective macro messages are ones that tell you, unlike the Coca-Cola one, exactly what's inside the bottle. At CNN, we give you real news, real fast. Federal Express delivers to the world on time. In BA Club World, you get more beds to more destination more often. We are big on quality, but little on price. The most effective macro messages are the ones that just have a little bit of a hint of humor behind them. I'm not very keen on kids and babies, but even I was impressed by a macro message that I saw recently on the side of a bus driving down the Earls Court Road. It had a picture of a huge gurgling baby's face, and next to it were the words that said, "Midwifery, the career that delivers." Towards the end of last September, I saw on a camping equipment website words which are obviously created by the owner, who not only was deeply sensitive to the passing of the season and that effect that would have on his business, but was also clearly a Shakespeare fan when he said, "Now is the winter of our discount tents." And even on the outside of my gym in High Street, Kensington, there's a sign that says, "If you are fat and ugly, you can just be ugly if you join a Virgin Active Health Club." But I'd like you to picture this scene, if you will. It's a vet surgery, and you see a bearded, slightly beady-eyed vet with a stethoscope around his neck, prodding a cute little furry animal with his stethoscope. And just as he's doing that, you know that his veterinary nurse is saying goodbye for the evening as she's leaving the surgery to go home. But he prods around, and then you see him tapping it. He prods around again, and suddenly he says, "Karen, I've got a cat with no pulse here. I need a bag of adrenaline and an IV drip, quick as you can, please." And the dental nurse comes sprinting back in. And then suddenly she stops and reaches towards the furry bundle and picks it up and puts it on her head, because it's not a cat, it's her fur hat. And we see the camera turn towards a cat sitting on the table on the other side of the room, looking at the vet as if to say, "There's no way that you're touching me." And suddenly a caption appears on the screen, "Should have gone to Specsavers." Now, that campaign has been around since 2002. And the reason why he's had such success and such longevity is because it manages to walk that very tight line between annoying and amusing over a long period of time. Politicians and political parties can only dream of the sort of level of influence that Specsavers have on our imagination. But it doesn't stop them trying. In 1979, the Conservatives were probably the first political party in our country to successfully use a macro message style slogan. Their slogan for the 1979 general election was, "Labour isn't working." And they emphasized that slogan by putting behind the words a photograph of a long dole queue snaking off into the distance. It worked very well. But towards the end of the Tory monopoly in 1997, for the general election that year, they produced a picture of Tony Blair with red devil's horns and black demonic eyes, and their macro message was, "New Labour, new danger." It was a bit crass and it was a bit tacky, but that doesn't necessarily matter. The reason why it failed so badly was because it was negative. It was based on hate rather than love. 2005, Michael Howard went negative again with a macro message, "Are you thinking what we're thinking?" And the answer was a big fat no, because Labour trounced them again. It was a vague question, and again, it was negative. But moving forward to 2015, the general election that year, the Tories did get it right. They didn't have a very highly adrenalized macro message, but they had one that was brutally effective. For about 6 months in advance of the general election, they pushed this macro message: "We're the only party that's got a long-term economic plan." Now, I did a version of this presentation in January 2016 for the London Business Forum, when memories of the 2015 general election 6 months previously were still reasonably fresh in people's minds. And I did a quick audience survey, bit of interaction, to find out whether people could still remember that phrase, "We've got a long-term economic plan." And about 75% of the audience could remember it. And then I asked them, what was the competing macro message slogan from the Labour campaign? And literally none of them could remember it. And that was one of the reasons why Labour lost that general election to David Cameron. But of course, the Tories didn't do so well last year. I'm now going to do a bit of an experiment. I'm going to take a bit of a risk, which I don't normally like doing. Now, cast your minds back to the general election last year. I'd like you to think whether you can remember what the Labour Party macro message slogan was. Please shout it out if you can remember. Say again? Hope? I don't think so. Any other ideas? Okay. Well, I'm going to suggest that's interesting. I believe that the macro message was this: for the many, not the few. Does that ring any bells now? Okay. Now that I've reminded you, let's try the test in a different way. Now that I've reminded you, would you please indulge me? Hands up those who, after that reminder, now do remember it. I'd say, Brendan, would you look around and agree? Is that about 70% or 65%? 60%, okay. Now, that was the Labour side. Can anyone remember what the macro message slogan was for the Conservative Party? Strong and stable. You didn't say that with much enthusiasm, did you? And for good reason. For good reason, I have to say. Now, how many other people can remember strong and stable? Brendan, you're the mathematician, clearly. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Now, strong and stable sticks in the mind less, I believe, because of several reasons. Number one, it was a personal message about Theresa May herself. It was a rather arrogant one, actually. It wasn't about Tory party policies. A political macro message really should be about policies, not a personality. Secondly, strong and stable, well, that's something that any political party could own. The Labour Party could say that they were strong and stable, so could the Lib Dems, possibly even UKIP could do. And thirdly, strong and stable was very easy for people to parody into weak and wobbly. Now, interestingly, I don't think in this country we've quite got the knack of political macro messages that they do in the United States. I think even it was 2008 when Barack Obama first came up with the phrase, "Yes, we can." And that carried him through to winning 2 presidential elections. And the phrase, "Make America Great," is something that we're not going to forget for a very long time, because often, let's face it, it does great, doesn't it? My prediction is this: if Donald Trump is the Republican candidate for president in 2020, and that's by no means guaranteed at this moment, his macro message slogan for that campaign will be, "Keep America Great." If in 2 years' time I'm right, remember that you heard it at the London Business Forum first. Now, these uranium-enriched, weapons-grade, in-your-face simplistic slogans work very well for politicians, but they won't work for you. And that's the reason that I want to tell you about them first, because I want you to differentiate yourself from politicians' practice. The great strength of a macro message, whether it's in advertising or in politics, is that it's designed for the whole world to see. The great weakness of a macro message is that it's designed for the whole world to see. You have to be much more bespoke in your approach. You can't afford to be getting your message off the shelf. Your messages have to be tailored at Savile Row. A macro message is a wide, diffuse floodlight. You in your presentations have to use a laser beam. And your laser beam is what I call a micro message. And I'm going to give you a definition for that phrase. A micro message is a sequence of words which quickly and compellingly captures the essence of your company, your product, or your idea in a way which is specifically tailored for the needs of that audience at that particular time. You see, a macro message, the ones I've been talking about previously, does not have that tailored effect. It doesn't have that feeling behind it that the audience has that flattery of having something prepared specifically for them. A micromessage is what you would say if you only had 10 seconds in which to say it. It's the hardcore essence of what you want to get across to the audience. You should think of your micromessages as being like a shiny crown jewel that you spent a great deal of time smoothing and polishing, that you've taken out of your pocket, that you've shown to your audience, and they're so delighted by it that they want to come up to you and stroke it and fondle it and take it out of your hand and put it in their pocket, take it away with them, and then show it to colleagues of theirs that didn't even see your speech. That is what a micromessage should be like. Ideally, a micromessage is one sentence with a verb. It's not going to be as short and snappy and glitzy as the Saatchi and Saatchi influenced macro messages that I've told you about earlier on. But the real attraction, the real key to a micromessage's success is that the audience should feel that it has been designed and created specifically for them. Now, in a few weeks' time, it's the British Open Golf Championships. And various golf equipment manufacturers hire huge tents around the golf course on which the Open is being played. Callaway are one of those manufacturers, and they schedule a presentation, about 8 presentations a day, on the hour, every hour, to various different types of audiences, because it's a prime target area for them to tout their wares. Let's say I'm a sales executive speaking on behalf of Callaway at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the audience for that particular presentation is an audience of golf shop owners who are there for commercial reasons. My micromessage to them might be, the Big Bertha range of clubs is the right range of clubs for you because the high public profile that we've created for them make them extremely easy to sell. But let's say I'm speaking at 10 o'clock, an hour later, to a different audience, an audience of golfers, high-ish handicap golfers, who are thinking of buying some new equipment for them to use themselves out on the golf course. My micromessage is going to be different. It might be this. The Big Bertha range of golf clubs is the right range of clubs for you because they allow you to hit the ball the longest possible distance in a straightish line at the most competitive price. So you see there 2 different audiences with different needs and requirements, 2 different micromessages, but both aiming for the same finishing position, that they would both want to purchase the Big Bertha range of golf clubs. You should spend more time on agonizing over the exact nature and the exact wording of a micromessage than on any other part of the preparation process. It's something that you might want to do on your own, or maybe with 2 or 3 colleagues whose opinions you trust. Because in my view, you've got no chance of a clear presentation, a clear and effective presentation, unless you've got a clear, effective, and distinctive micromessage. The 3 characteristics of an effective micromessage are as follows. Number 1, it should be boldly memorable. Number 2, it should deal with a burning issue that the audience has. And number 3, it should leave the audience eager to learn more from you. So, I'll summarize where we've got to so far. Step number 1 is analyze your audience. Step number 2 is to use that information to choose your positions. Step number 3 is create your micromessage. I should tell you that creating a micromessage is something that you've got to do well in advance of your presentation. Because not only is it something that you're going to say out loud during the course of your presentation so that it is remembered by the audience and acted on, it's also something that's going to be used much earlier than that because it's going to be used to drive the rest of the writing process. And so that brings me on to step number 4, which is gathering your evidence. I suggest at this point that you go low tech. You take a piece of A4 paper, you write an oval in the middle. In that oval, you write out your micromessage, word for word. And then draw lots of spikes, lots of legs coming off the oval, so it looks like a big fat centipede. And then, either on your own, or again with trusted colleagues, you brainstorm all the potential headings, all the potential elements that might support your micromessage. And hopefully you'll come up with a hell of a lot, probably far more than 5. let's say you come up with 27 different pieces of knowledge, just like those barristers who were doing presentations in court to influence a jury. Now, I have a lot of sympathy with barristers who tried to include everything in their speeches, because after all, they wanted to make sure that they didn't leave anything out at all. They didn't want to ever be accused of having been negligent in fighting for their clients' well-being, and they wanted to make sure they didn't leave anything out. They were going to cram absolutely everything in, because there's no time limit to a jury speech. But in the real world, we do have a time limit. Attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. You know that you can't include all 27 headings. You have to find a way of honing down those 27 down to 3 or 5. The first way, you need a couple of filters. I'm going to give you 2 filters today. The first filter is this. You look again hard at your micromessage, and you look at each heading and think, does this heading absolutely, definitely, dead center support my core micromessage? Or is it just something that's vaguely related to my micromessage? If it's not a hardcore, 100% supporter, out it goes. Cross out that heading. You'll chop out quite a lot of your headings doing that. The next chopping or filtering process involves what I call the factual or informational filter. Nice to know, should know, must know. Look at each heading that you've got left and consider, is this a nice to know? Well, nice to knows are cuddly, fluffy, pleasant, nice things to have in a presentation. In 2018, we haven't got time for any of them. Out they go. The should knows. Well, the word should is often prefaced by the word maybe. Maybe they should know this. Maybe they should know that. This is the presentation paranoia department. Just maybe you will have time for a should know, but you probably won't. In any presentation that you do, you've only got time for the must knows. That may sound brutal, but that may sound unambitious. But just pause and think for a moment. All the presentations and speeches you've heard over the last month, over the last year, over the last 10 years, looking back, from how many of them can you remember the equivalent of a micromessage and 5 key supporting elements? I suggest to you that probably the answer is none. So if you manage to do a presentation where the audience remember and act on a micromessage and 3 or 5 key elements, you've done better than 99.99% of public speakers ever in the history of humanity. That is the level of ambition that I'm looking for from you. So, you've used those filters to decide on, say, the 5 key heading elements, your evidence. But then you have to do something which probably goes against your gut instinct. You have to actually write out words, preferably on a computer screen rather than on a piece of paper, under each heading. And when I say write out, I don't mean just do a few bullet points. Write out word for word, full sentences, which tell a narrative story underneath each heading. That's a painful thing to do, but it is worth doing that process. Some people say to me, well, look, I get the inspiration for the exact words that I'll say by just looking into the faces of the audience that I'm presenting to, that particular topic. Trust me on this, as barristers often say. You'll get far more inspiration sitting in a quiet room in front of a computer 2 days in advance than you will do when you're staring in the face of the audience that you're trying to persuade. Grit your teeth and type it out. And then you have the chance to use the most powerful key on the computer keyboard, the delete button. because that first draft that you come out with won't be the best draft. You need to be able to see those words and consider, what can I possibly leave out? Or what doesn't quite work? Or what doesn't work when I say it out loud? You can only do that if you've typed it out in advance. And when you're typing it out, start each new sentence on a fresh line. Don't use paragraphs, because paragraphs are to be read, not spoken. If you start out each sentence on a new line, you will actually be able to see the wood and the trees. So, we've got to the stage where you've been persuaded, hopefully by me, to write out the words under each element. Because you see, the thing is, the words that you include in a presentation are what make that presentation strong. But it's the words that you leave out which made that presentation even stronger. I believe that for any subject that you're likely to speak about, as I said a few minutes before, you know too much about it. You have a huge, almost pyramid of knowledge. Like that. That represents your entire knowledge of a particular subject. This is the Luxor Hotel and Casino Pyramid in Las Vegas. It's got 4,400 rooms. It's a vast complex of joy and entertainment. But think of that as being a metaphor representing your knowledge. You've only got time to get across the knowledge that's right at the top of the pyramid, the sharp bit right at the end there in a presentation. Hopefully, you'll stimulate the audience so that they want to know more and dip down deeper into your personal pyramid knowledge. Hopefully in Q&A or interaction after the presentation, but you can only get across the stuff that's in the sharp point during the course of your main narrative presentation. And that's what I'm trying to do today. If you use the micromessage and key elements in the right way, it will transform your presentations in the same way as the Luxor pyramid is transformed at night. Because from that room at the top of the Luxor pyramid, a laser beam shines up into the sky to make sure that helicopters don't crash into it at 2 o'clock in the morning. That laser beam is your micromessage, and it's the laser beam that you want people to be able to see from hundreds of miles away. And I'd like you to think of your presentation as being that shiny pyramid, but it's only the very top level of key elements that will help you to produce the laser beam. When you're writing out the narrative presentation under each heading, you may sort of think, well, I don't really want to produce a full script, because eventually, when I present it, it'll sound unnatural. Well, you're right. I don't like to think of what you're writing out as a script. It's what I call a baseline text. These are words which will probably form about 75 or 80% of what you'll say under pressure in front of the audience that you're trying to persuade. But they won't be word for word exact. It's not a poem that you're writing out. The words that you create during this narrative process should eventually end up as being a fairly accurate guide, but not a restrictive straitjacket. You will think of other words when you're actually on your feet, but nevertheless, you'll think of your best ones in front of your typewriter long before the presentation. So that's step 4, gathering the evidence. We still have the challenge of starting your presentation. What words do you use right at the start? Well, you could start your presentation with pleasantries. I could have started this morning telling you what an enormous privilege it is to be speaking for the second time to the London Business Forum. I could have paid Brendan and his staff an awful lot of compliments, thanked them for inviting me, said nice things about the catering, the food, and the location. I could have spent 2 or 3 minutes doing that, because that's how most people start their presentations. Well, that would have been extremely boring. It's also very, very rude, because again, in attention deficit land, we don't have time for pleasantries at the start of a presentation. I wanted to get straight to the point. Pleasantries are very much a 20th century way of starting, because they waste people's time. Pleasantries are like starting a presentation, let's think in terms of air travel, a jumbo jet rolling out of its hangar, slowly going along the runway, and eventually getting up into the air. Every presentation that you do should be like a jet, a fighter jet, flying off an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean, going straight off and straight up into the sky, getting straight to the point. You should start off the presentation with what I call a spike. And this is step 5. Sharpen your spikes. A spike is something that turns the audience on without being so crass that it turns the audience off. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a charity fundraiser speaking to a small audience of donors who've given me quite a lot of money before, but I happen to know from my audience research that they're a little bit skeptical about the way that we've spent money recently, and also they're a bit skeptical because of some rather negative press that we've had over the last few days. But I've decided to make the most of those potential negatives in phrasing my opening spike. Ladies and gentlemen, 80% of the world's resources are used by 20%. I'll start that again. I am a professional, don't try this at home. 80% of the world's resources are used by 20% of the world's population. There is plenty to go around. The problem is unfair distribution. And that is where we at Oxfam make a difference every single day. Another example, very different to that, I recently had the privilege of working with several Royal Marines who've left the armed services and are becoming professional speakers. And mainly they're speaking to raise funds for a Wounded Warrior project to help look after armed servicemen who have moved away and are unable to look after themselves because of the injuries they've suffered. This particular speaker has a particular facial appearance because of something that happened to him during an armed conflict. And we decided to make the most of that in phrasing his opening spike, which is as follows. I was lying face down in a puddle of muddy, smelly water at the bottom of a bomb crater. I lifted my head slowly to see if I could spot the enemy, when suddenly I heard a bang, and I felt down the side of my face the most intense pain that I've ever felt in my life. And then I looked down, and floating in the puddle was my right cheek and my right ear. I'd just been mutilated by a Taliban sniper. But the good news was that I had one ear left. Now, I'm very pleased to say that every time that he does that speech, he gets a standing ovation and raises a lot of money, and quite deservedly so. I once saw a speech by a lady who was responsible for fundraising for a particular hospital that has a particular level of skills for a particular type of patient. And when I saw her starting her speech, I thought she was going to come out with the same old pleasantry platitudes and waste our time. I'm glad to say I was completely wrong. It was a St. George's Day charity lunch, and she started off her speech like this. Ladies and gentlemen, I've really enjoyed this St. George's Day lunch. I love roast beef. And I could tell, looking around the room, that you all love roast beef too. But imagine how much less you would have enjoyed it if your hands and your arms were paralyzed, And every piece of meat that was put in your mouth had to be cut up and placed there by the person sitting next to you because you're incapable of doing it yourself. It's people like that that we look after, and we need your money to do it even better. Now, a few years ago, I had slightly more credibility as a criminal barrister than I do now. And I was defending somebody in Guildford Crown Court on a theft charge. He was accused of stealing a few pieces of wood from a building site on which he was working. When I say a few pieces, I mean, well, a couple of lorry loads, actually. But his defense was that he was just doing what his foreman had told him to do. And I spoke to him quite a lot at great length, and I made my own assessment of his IQ level and the sort of bloke he was. And once you spoke to him and realized the sort of chap he wasn't the sharpest tool in the box. Once you realized that, you could realize that his defense did have a certain amount of credibility. And it allowed me to deal with the challenge of defending him in a particular way. I didn't cross-examine any of the prosecution witnesses. I didn't question any of their evidence at all. I just put my client in the witness box, allowed him to talk, and allowed the audience, the jury, to make their own assessment of them. But I managed to, that gave me a way of starting my closing speech with this spike. Members of the jury, just look at him. Eloquent, intellectual, loquacious, perspicacious. These are just four of the words that my client can't even spell. He is thicker than any of the planks of wood on that building site. Now, the jury undoubtedly found me arrogant, pompous, and offensive. Unusual for a barrister, I know. But I was deliberately trying to shock them into looking at things the other way up. I managed to surprise them out of their comfort zone into my persuasion zone. They found him not guilty, and he now works at a building site somewhere near you. So start your presentation with a spike. I suggest you also finish a presentation with a spike so that your presentation almost has the structure of being a double-headed spear. I'm not going to give you an example of a closing spike now because I'm going to use one later. See what you think about it. And now, a quick word about delivery and slides. We do have a few minutes left. If you've been asleep up until now, now would be the time to wake up, because I'm about to show a slide which I believe is the best use of slides. If John F. Kennedy had been a presentation coach instead of a politician, he would have said, ask not what your slides can do for you, ask what your slides can do for your audience. I couldn't really have got the concept of the black shiny pyramid across without showing a picture, and I could do a summary of my key elements without a bullet point slide, but it's much better just once during the course of the presentation to use one. Those are the 5 steps you should remember. Analyze your audience, decide on your positions, create your micro-message, assemble your evidence, and sharpen your spikes. If you remember nothing else from today, that is what you should take away. I'm a huge enemy of death by bullet point, but that is probably the best way that you should use slides to emphatically enhance what has already been said. Never use a fully typed out script, because if you do, you'll end up with a very stilted delivery, with your head down on the lectern like this, looking up occasionally at exactly the wrong time, looking like a finance director with a very shiny, sweaty head. Nevertheless, always use some notes. I've got some notes on a couple of cards on my lectern. And the reason why I have notes today specifically is this. It would have looked perhaps smoother if I didn't have any notes. It would be a smooth cabaret performance. But today isn't about cabaret. It's about giving you a certain set of specific and precise information. And in order to do that, I want to make sure I've got something that reminds me of it. That's why I use the cards. Also, I know that if I get heckled, or there's a fire alarm, or someone attacks me or tries to give me a P45 on stage, no matter what happens, I will know exactly where I was in the presentation just by looking at one of my cards. And thirdly, I'm always slightly suspicious of speakers who don't use any notes at all, because I always think that that makes it look as if they've just done that presentation 100 times and they haven't created something that's specifically for that audience. Well, these notes and this speech is specifically for you. I am going to take some questions very briefly afterwards, I hope, and I hope you'll feel free to ask them. But I'm going to finish by telling you this. The bad news is there is no such thing as a perfect public speaker. But the good news is that if you use my 5-step method, you will be a powerful and effective one instead. That is my micro message to you today. And then, if you use it, in all your presentations, you'll be able to say it, support it, and shut it. I hope that you'll be so enthused by your new presentation skills when you go back to work that your colleagues will ask you about them and where you found them. And the answer you'll give will be, should have gone to the London Business Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, if you liked me, I've been Graham Davis, and if you didn't, I'm Theresa May.
Okay, so we do have time for a few questions. Who has the first question for Graham? Maybe somebody's got a presentation coming up. They'd like a bit of advice. Who's going to be brave and ask a question?
Lady in the front here, Brendan? Oh, no, you're one at the back. Yep.
You go down the front, and I'll go to the lady here. Yeah.
Take you a second. Yeah.
Thanks.
Right. Okay.
It's really just to ask, when is it best to ask questions? Do you think it's best to wait to the end, or do you think during the presentation?
I prefer to leave it to the end for questions because I'd like to give the audience a basis, a baseline, a foundation from which they can ask questions and they can actually come up with stuff that they need to know more. However, if someone had put their hand up during the course of the presentation and asked me something spontaneously at that moment, I would have answered it. And I think that you should always be open-minded to the possibility of questions during your presentation, but gently encourage your audience to leave it to the end. But I don't think you should completely finish with questions at the end. You should make sure that you have a summary that really finishes off your presentation neatly right at the end after Q&A, which is hopefully what I'm going to demonstrate in a few minutes' time. Lady there?
How important do you think body language is when you're delivering your presentation?
Spoken language is vastly more important than any body language. There's a study by somebody called Albert Morabian, which is now 55 years old, which suggests, or is often misquoted, and it says that the words that you say make up only 7% of your message. Well, frankly, that's rubbish. I don't really care what your hands do, where your feet are, where you're moving. I do care about what you're saying, what your micro message is, and what the key elements are that support that micro message. Yes, you probably shouldn't have body language that is distracting, that's a bit weird, but as long as people think that you're using your body in an authentic way, and that's the real you, it's your spoken language you should focus on, not your body language. Gentleman here.
In the past, I've done some presentations to kind of senior kind of director community, and I prepare in advance, and I've got it all mapped out, and then I get in, and then within seconds, I'm being kind of derailed by the finance director, kind of taking it off another path, preempting kind of later bits, and I've kind of any kind of ideas to bring it, because I'm trying not to be aggressively rude to say, look, don't ask that question now. But I find sometimes I'm quite passive aggressive to trying to bring it back because I'm feeling quite stressed.
That's a very common problem, especially when you're doing it in a boardroom type scenario or to a very, very senior management. They want to take over the presentation rather than allow you to do the presentation. Well, first of all, ideally, you should rehearse your presentation in front of a really good group of colleagues who are sympathetic to that, and you should rehearse the possibility of the finance director or the chief executive hijacking you in that way so that you're ready for the hijack. So make sure you're ready for the hijack and you've got some hijack options. But number two, also try, without being too much of a bully about it at the beginning, to say, I know that during the course of my presentations, some of you may want to ask some questions straight away, but could I courteously ask you, please maybe to leave it until I finish my presentation, which is only 10 minutes long, to ask those questions, because that will give a better context from which you can ask your questions. So a combination of those two, I think, is the right result. Gentleman there and then the lady. Should we have the gentleman first and then the lady?
Do you have any tips for combating nerves? I mean, I guess preparation, obviously, but assuming that you've done your preparation, but you still get nervous, any tips?
You're absolutely right. Preparation is the best foundation, because you should allow yourself to feel proud of your audience analysis and the fact that you've prepared something which very specifically caters for the needs of that audience. So that should give you a very good foundation of confidence. In the medium term, the best way of enhancing your confidence is to rehearse out loud as much as possible, and especially to rehearse out loud with battle conditions scenarios like the hijacking finance director that the other gentleman mentioned. Rehearsal and practice under battle conditions really enhances your confidence a lot. And thirdly, the thing I was certainly doing today to change my negative nerves into positive adrenaline, as I was sitting there this morning, all I do is focus on the first 2 lines of the presentation again and again and again. Time is your most valuable asset because it's an asset that cannot be replaced. And by continually focusing on those words for the last 2 minutes before I was up, I didn't have time or energy to be nervous. Lady there?
Yeah, that was my question as well.
Oh, right.
But I suppose an observation instead of the question. One thing I've done is struggle to stop talking at the end, so it'll be, oh, and this, oh, and that. But I guess that's maybe where the spike comes in, because it stops you.
Well, inevitably, once you see an audience in front of you, and hopefully an enthusiastic audience, a bit of adrenaline does kick in, and you will want to think of other things. But you're right, you do have to control that as well. And here's a picture for you to maybe think of it. Think, oh, I'm on a roll, I'm on a roll, I'm on a roll, but mustn't keep talking. I'll pull the handbrake up now. And if you mentally pull up your handbrake, you can stop yourself speaking.
Okay, we've got time for one more final question. Yes, just there.
Hi, Graham.
Hello.
You talked about analysing the audience before you go in. What tips have you got for analysing the audience in the moment? Because I can tend to speak either too fast or too slow, and I wondered how you were analysing us during the last 72 minutes.
When I get excited, I know I speak slightly too fast. I start tripping over my words, as I did a couple of times today. But I put my own personal handbrake on, paused, and there was one particular line that I decided to do again because I'd flubber-dubbed over it. So inevitably, yes, adrenaline causes speed, but I can say this to you. The human ear can listen far faster than the human mouth can speak. I've never heard a presentation go badly because a speaker has actually said the words too quickly. I have heard presentations go badly because people speak too slowly. So I don't think that's anything that you should worry about too much. Speed is a good thing, I believe, in 2018, as long as you don't flubber-dub. And also, today, I did try and sprinkle in a little bit of interaction, and I did try to tell a couple of gags. And all I can say is, thank you for laughing at them, because that made me feel better at the various times that I told them. Just to finish off, think the most important thing that you should take away from today is the concept of the micromessage, because it's the micromessage that will light up the room that you are presenting in. And now, as my final closing spike, I'm going to leave you with the 3 cardinal rules of public speaking. Rule number 1 is always leave your audience wanting more. Goodbye.